French Connection, The Conversation, Superman. Gene Hackman has died at the age of 95.
On the afternoon of February 26th, 2025, a maintenance worker walked up to a stucco Pueblo Revival home tucked into the hills above Santa Fe, New Mexico, expecting to do nothing more than routine upkeep. He had worked for the family for 16 years. What he found inside that house would trigger a nationwide investigation, a wave of speculation across every major news outlet in America, and ultimately, months later, a set of answers that were far sadder and far more human than anyone had guessed. This is the story of what really happened to Gene Hackman, one of the greatest actors of his generation, and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, and how a case that was first called suspicious turned out to be something else entirely, a quiet tragedy that had been unfolding for days without anyone knowing. The front door was unlocked. That was the first thing investigators noted. Inside, the house was still, and it did not take long for the worker and a colleague to realize something was deeply wrong. Deputies from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office arrived shortly after and began working through the property room by room. Betsy Arakawa, 65 years old, a classically trained pianist who had built a quiet, private life alongside her husband, was found in a bathroom. Nearby was an open prescription bottle with pills scattered across the countertop. Gene Hackman, 95, was found in a mudroom near the back of the house, not far from the kitchen. A cane and a pair of sunglasses lay close to his body. There was no sign that anyone had broken in. There was no visible trauma on either body. And yet something about the scene did not sit right with the deputies on site. Both bodies showed advanced signs of decomposition. Investigators would later describe mummification in Arakawa's hands and feet, and Hackman's body showed similar changes. Whatever had happened here, it had happened a while ago, long before anyone arrived to find them. Of the couple's 3 dogs, 2 were alive, wandering the property. A third was found dead inside a crate near where Arakawa's body lay. Detectives would later suggest the dog had likely died of dehydration or starvation, a grim detail that only reinforced how long the house had sat silent. Given the unusual circumstances, the state of the bodies, the unclear timeline, the fact that 2 people who lived together had apparently died apart from each other in different rooms, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office did something that made headlines around the world. They labeled the deaths suspicious enough in nature to require a thorough search and investigation. That single phrase, appearing in a search warrant affidavit, was enough to launch 1,000 theories. Within days, the story had gone global. Gene Hackman was not just any actor. He was a 2-time Academy Award winner, a man whose face had defined American cinema for 4 decades. The idea that he and his wife could be found dead under murky circumstances in a home that had apparently sat undisturbed for what looked like weeks was almost impossible for the public to process. Early theories ran in every direction. Carbon monoxide poisoning was the first and most obvious guess, especially once a space heater was found knocked over near Arakawa's body. The New Mexico Gas Company was called in to inspect the property's gas lines. Investigators wanted to rule out a leak before anything else. Some wondered whether one of the 2 had suffered a medical event and the other, unable to get help or unwilling to go on afterward, had followed. Others speculated darkly about foul play, pointing to the unlocked front door as evidence that a third party might have been present at some point. None of these theories, on their own, added up cleanly, and that was part of what made the case so unsettling to outside observers. A veteran death investigator, unconnected to the case, told reporters at the time that in decades of work, it was rare to see 2 people in a household die at roughly the same time without one obvious shared cause: a fire, a gas leak, a violent act. The Hackman house offered none of those obvious explanations, at least not at first glance. Meanwhile, gas company technicians completed their inspection of the property. They found no leak. Carbon monoxide, the theory that had dominated the first wave of headlines, was quietly ruled out even before the toxicology results came back. It would take investigators weeks to reconstruct what actually happened inside that house. And when they did, the picture that emerged was not a mystery so much as a slow, devastating sequence of ordinary events. Digital records recovered from Arakawa's computer showed that in the days before her death, she had been searching online for information about COVID-19 symptoms, flu symptoms, dizziness, and nosebleeds. An email she sent to her massage therapist on February 11th mentioned that her husband had taken a COVID test after experiencing symptoms similar to a cold. She had also made attempts to seek medical care, reaching out to a local health clinic, though she never received treatment there. Investigators were later able to trace Arakawa's movements on what turned out to be the last day anyone had contact with her. She exchanged an email with her massage therapist around 11:20 in the morning. In the afternoon, cell phone and location data placed her at a Sprouts Farmers Market. By roughly 5:15 in the evening, she had returned to the gated community where the couple lived. After that, there is no further record of activity from her. The cause, when a medical examiner's office finally announced it more than a week after the bodies were discovered, was not poisoning, and it was not violence. Betsy Arakawa had died of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare and rarely discussed illness spread through exposure to rodent droppings and urine. It is not contagious between people. It is not something that announces itself with any particular drama. It begins like a cold or the flu with fever and body aches, and in a minority of cases it progresses rapidly to fluid in the lungs, and from there, if untreated, to organ failure. According to the New Mexico Department of Health, the disease has a mortality rate approaching 40% in the region, and only a handful of cases are confirmed in the state each year. Chief Medical Investigator Dr. Heather Jarrell explained that once the syndrome reaches its later stage, a person can go from flu-like symptoms to death within a day or two, sometimes collapsing suddenly, in what she described as a kind of terminal collapse. That detail, more than any other, explained why Arakawa was found on the bathroom floor near scattered pills that turned out to be nothing more sinister than a regular thyroid medication. The timeline that investigators pieced together was, in its own way, more heartbreaking than any of the theories that had circulated online. Arakawa is believed to have died around February 11th. Hackman, according to the last recorded activity on his pacemaker, likely died around February 18th, a full week later. For that week, Gene Hackman appears to have been alone in the house with his wife's body, unaware or unable to fully process what had happened. He was, by that point, in an advanced stage of Alzheimer's disease. When asked directly whether Hackman had known his wife had died, Dr. Jarrell told reporters it was a difficult question to answer, but that given the severity of his condition, it was quite possible he simply did not understand what had happened to her. His own autopsy painted a picture of a man whose body had been quietly failing for years, kept going by a combination of medical intervention and, evidently, his wife's constant care. The report described severe atherosclerotic and hypertensive cardiovascular disease. He had a history of congestive heart failure, coronary artery stents, a bypass graft, and a prior aortic valve replacement. He had received a biventricular pacemaker back in 2019. The exam also found evidence of previous silent heart attacks. Toxicology showed no alcohol, no carbon monoxide above normal background levels, and no intoxicating substances. There was, however, a small but telling detail: an elevated level of acetone in his blood, far above what's normally found in the body. Medical experts explained that this kind of reading is consistent with a body that has gone an extended period without food, essentially shifting into a state of fasting-induced ketosis. There was no food in his stomach at the time of his death, and investigators concluded he likely hadn't eaten in the days leading up to it. Notably, he did not show signs of dehydration, which suggested he had still been able to access water on his own in his wife's absence. When the medical examiner's office finally closed the loop, months after the initial discovery, the answer was almost painfully mundane by the standards of the headlines that had run in the days after the couple was found. Gene Hackman had died of heart disease, with advanced Alzheimer's listed as a significant contributing factor. There was no foul play. There was no poisoning. There was no unresolved mystery. There was simply an elderly, ailing man, alone in his own home, whose wife, the person who had quietly managed his care for years, had died suddenly and without warning, leaving him to decline on his own until his own weakened heart finally gave out. It's worth pausing on who Betsy Arakawa actually was, because in a frenzy of speculation that followed the discovery, she was too often reduced to a footnote in her husband's story. Arakawa was a trained classical pianist, born in Hawaii, who had studied at the University of Southern California. She met Gene Hackman in the mid-1980s while working at a gym in California, and the two married in 1991, several years after Hackman's first marriage had ended. By all accounts, this was a genuinely close and private partnership. Hackman's daughter, Leslie, later told reporters that Betsy had played an enormous role in keeping her father active and healthy well into his 90s, noting that he had remained physically capable, practicing yoga and Pilates multiple times a week, right up until his health took its final turn. Leslie described her stepmother as someone who watched over her father's well-being constantly, and said she felt a deep gratitude toward her for the care she had provided over the years. Dr. Michael Baden, a former New York City medical examiner who commented publicly on the case, observed that a man in Hackman's condition would typically require full-time nursing care, and that Arakawa had effectively been providing that care herself, right up until the moment her own illness overtook her. It's a detail that reframes the entire tragedy. This was not a case of two people found dead under sinister circumstances in a mansion. It was the story of a devoted, largely self-sufficient couple in their final years, quietly managing serious health challenges out of the public eye until an entirely unforeseeable illness, one neither of them could have anticipated or defended against, took one of them suddenly, leaving the other unable to survive without her. Once the toxicology and forensic results were in, investigators were able to rule out the darker theories almost entirely. There had been no forced entry. There was no trauma on either body. The gas leak theory had already been eliminated by the utility company's own inspection days earlier. A necropsy was performed on the couple's dog that had died in its crate, though officials attributed that death most likely to dehydration or starvation in the days following Arakawa's death, since no one remained in the house to care for the animals. Santa Fe County Sheriff Adon Mendoza noted that there had been no indication of a caregiver visiting the home during the period in question, which helps explain why so much time passed before anyone realized something was wrong. The couple lived a famously private life, and their remote, gated property meant that weeks could pass without a neighbor or visitor noticing anything amiss. The dry, high-altitude climate of Santa Fe, nearly 7,200 feet in elevation, also played a role in the story investigators eventually told. That kind of environment, officials explained, can accelerate the drying and preservation of remains, producing the kind of mummification effects noted in both bodies. It offered a scientific explanation for the detail that had unsettled early investigators and fueled so much of the online speculation. A level of decomposition and preservation so unusual that some had assumed something more elaborate must be at play. To understand why this story captured so much attention, it helps to remember exactly what Gene Hackman meant to American film. He was, by any measure, one of the defining actors of the 20th century, a performer capable of moving seamlessly between menace, comedy, and quiet tragedy. His breakthrough came with 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, in which he played Buck Barrow, a role that earned him his first Academy Award nomination. From there, his career accelerated rapidly. In 1971, he starred as Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, a tough, morally compromised New York detective whose portrayal won Hackman the Academy Award for Best Actor and helped redefine the American crime film. 3 years later, he took on a very different kind of role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, playing a surveillance expert consumed by guilt and isolation, a performance widely regarded as one of the finest of his career, in a film that was itself nominated for Best Picture. Hackman had a rare gift for range. In the same decade that saw him play haunted, morally serious men, he also stepped into the role of Lex Luthor in 1978's Superman, turning the character into a wickedly funny, endlessly quotable villain who proved Hackman could be just as compelling playing comedy as he was playing tragedy. Later in his career, he won a second Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actor, for his role as a violent, unforgiving sheriff in Clint Eastwood's 1992 Western Unforgiven, a performance many critics consider one of the greatest supporting turns in film history. He would go on to appear in more than 80 films across his career, including Hoosiers, Get Shorty, and The Royal Tenenbaums, continually proving that his talent for drama never dulled his gift for comic timing. Hackman retired from acting in the mid-2000s, citing health concerns, and largely disappeared from public life. He spent his retirement years painting, writing historical fiction novels with a co-author, and living quietly with Arakawa in Santa Fe, far from the industry that had made him famous. He served for a time on the board of trustees of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and invested in local businesses in the community he and his wife called home. When news of his death finally broke, tributes poured in from across Hollywood. Clint Eastwood, who directed Hackman in Unforgiven and acted alongside him in the film, released a statement calling him one of the most talented actors he had ever worked with, and said he considered Hackman a close friend whom he would miss deeply. Actress Gwyneth Paltrow, who co-starred with Hackman in The Royal Tenenbaums, shared a tribute of her own on social media. Hackman's family, his daughters Elizabeth and Leslie, and his granddaughter Annie, released a joint statement describing the loss in deeply personal terms. To the millions of fans who admired his acting, they said he was one of the greatest performers of his generation. But to them, he was simply a father and a grandfather, and his absence left an emptiness that words could not fully capture. It's tempting in true crime-style storytelling to lean into the unanswered questions, the eerie details, the unsettling coincidences. And in the first days after Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were found, there were plenty of unanswered questions to lean into. But the story that eventually emerged, backed by months of forensic investigation and a detailed public accounting from New Mexico's chief medical examiner, wasn't a thriller. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more affecting. It was the story of a 95-year-old man, already deep into a battle with Alzheimer's disease, whose heart had been failing by inches for years, kept alive as much by his wife's daily devotion as by any medical procedure. It was the story of a 65-year-old woman who spent her final days quietly searching the internet for explanations for symptoms that, in hindsight, pointed toward a rare and often fatal illness that almost no one thinks to guard against. And it was the story of what happens when both of those lives end within the same house, within the same week, far from anyone who might have noticed in time. There was no gas leak. There was no intruder. There was no pact, no violence, no hidden secret waiting behind a locked door. There was simply an old married couple, deeply private, deeply devoted to one another, whose final chapter unfolded exactly the way so many quiet tragedies do. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with days passing unnoticed, one after another, until it was too late for anyone to help. Gene Hackman spent his career playing men who were haunted, complicated, and often larger than life. In the end, his own story turned out to be something far more universal. The story of aging, of illness, of a marriage that endured almost to its final hour, and of how easily even a famous life can end in silence. If this story affected you and you'd like to talk to someone, please reach out to a trusted friend, family member, or a mental health professional. You don't have to carry difficult feelings alone.